Hello, and thanks for joining me for this episode of Lights Out, your virtual campfire. I'm your hostess with the mostest ghosties, Sylvia Schultz. You guys all know my fascination with mental hospitals. I love the Peoria State Hospital so much for its compassionate care of the mentally ill. But for hundreds of years, those suffering with mental health problems didn't get that compassionate care. It's up to us to remember those barbaric treatments so they never happen again. Helping us to remember is the Glore Psychiatric Museum in St. Joseph, Missouri. It began as a display of outmoded treatments, a warning against the barbarism of earlier times. But in the years since its beginning, it has become so much more. And with all 4 floors of the building housing artifacts from State Lunatic Asylum No. 2, it's no surprise that the museum is said to be haunted. Join me for a peek into the world of a state mental hospital as we go Lights Out. The State Hospital for the Insane No. 2, more informally known as Lunatic Asylum No. 2, opened its doors to the insane of Missouri in 1874. It had 275 beds at the time, which were quickly filled. More were added, 120, then 250, as more patients began to arrive. In 1899, the institution would become known as the St. Joseph State Hospital, a vast improvement in image. But there were still issues. By the early 1950s, the asylum could care for 3,000 patients. Some were merely depressed, but some were criminally insane and dangerous to themselves and others. As with many state hospitals, St. Joseph State Hospital did the best they could with what they had. They cared for the patients that were entrusted to them. Some of their treatments were experimental, but they did try to do their best by their patients. The Glore Museum actually had very modest, almost unambitious beginnings. The seed of the museum was a collection of displays for a state hospital open house, put together in 1966 by George Glore for Mental Health Awareness Week. Glore was the occupational therapist for the St. Joseph State Hospital. He asked his patients for help in creating the life-size displays that describe mental health treatments in the 17th, 18th, and 19th centuries. So the displays include a dark straw-lined hovel with chains on the walls, handcuffs, straitjackets, and cages. The O'Halloran's swing was a contraption that would spin around at approximately 100 revolutions per minute, more than once a second if you don't feel like doing the math. It was supposed to improve blood circulation to a patient's brain. Instead, it just made people barf. Another device was the horrifically named lunatic box, in which patients were made to stand for hours. It was about the size of a coffin, stood on end. Violent patients were left in the lunatic box to calm down. They weren't even allowed out to use the bathroom. Not helpful. Happily, though, this is only a small part of the museum, which since 1997 has been housed in what used to be a clinic for patients of the St. Joseph State Hospital. The original 1874 building is now a state prison, and Northwest Missouri Psychiatric Rehabilitation, a 108-bed facility, now serves the area's mental health patients, right across the street from the original hospital. Hospital officials were so impressed with George Glore's display that they encouraged him to expand, and in 1967 the Glore Museum opened to illustrate how the treatment of mental illness has evolved. The museum has over 10,000 items on display. Some of these items are incredibly moving. They speak to the daily lives of the people who came here seeking help for the demons that dwelled within their minds. The television diary was discovered in 1971. A patient wrote over 500 secret notes, then stuffed them into one of the hospital ward televisions, apparently believing that the TV would transmit the information. Another patient saved 108,000 cigarette packs, thinking that they could be redeemed for a wheelchair. His efforts weren't entirely in vain. There was no such program, but in 1969, staff at the hospital, feeling sorry for the guy, chipped in and bought him a wheelchair. One of the eeriest exhibits in the museum is also the oldest. In 1910, one of the patients at the asylum died unexpectedly. During her autopsy, doctors discovered that she had eaten 1,446 nails, bolts, screws, and buttons. The items are now displayed in a glass case in an unsettling but spookily fascinating starburst arrangement. Speaking of art, another display features artwork created by patients and later donated to the museum. There is a stainless steel bracelet made in the 1940s. A patient bent a piece of silverware, polished it, engraved it, and presented it as a gift to an employee. Displayed just below this is a necklace created by a patient out of vegetables. Following a fad of the 1970s, patients would poke holes through chunks of mixed vegetables like peas, carrots, parsnips, or potatoes, dry them, paint them, and use them as beads. This particular necklace was made from blue and silver beads and chunks of potato painted with white enamel. It's oddly pretty. One of the most deeply fascinating pieces of artwork is a mosaic of an oriental figure, brilliantly and painstakingly executed, made entirely out of eggshells. Eggshell mosaics were made by patients in occupational therapy during the 1960s. It became a popular art form as it was engrossing for the patients and cost the hospital next to nothing for the supplies, as the eggshells came from the hospital's kitchen. The shells were ground to varying sizes and dyed to use as a medium for creating mosaics like this. I love art. I don't think of myself as being any good at visual art. Words are more my thing. But I can appreciate art when I see it. And seeing people who have been neglected, forgotten, pushed aside by society, who still keep that creative spark alive in themselves, it's just marvelous and humbling at the same time. So let's get to the ghosts. As with any state hospital, some of the patients at St. Joseph's State Hospital never had any visitors, spending their lives alone and forgotten. It's possible that some of these lost souls still wander the halls of the old clinic. The basement of the museum building was the site of the morgue, so there may be some residual psychic trauma hanging around in there anyway. It's said that motion detectors will go off even when there's no one walking around in the basement. No one living, that is. People have also reported hearing a woman's soft voice asking for help in the hallways. Other witnesses have reported the apparition of a man who runs at people in the basement hallway yelling, "Why are you here? Get out!" I found it fascinating to wander the exhibits at the museum, and of course I saved the basement for last. In addition to the morgue and the physical therapy room, the basement is where you can find the Yellow Rose and the Jukebox Hero. These are two vehicles restored by young patients at Woodson Children's Psychiatric Hospital. This institution emphasized vocational therapy such as woodshop and auto tech. The Yellow Rose is a 1978 Chevrolet Monte Carlo, and the Jukebox Hero is a 1987 Toyota pickup truck. The Yellow Rose is not designed to run, or even start, but she and Jukebox Hero have both won many awards in car shows all over Missouri. The mirrors, running boards, and walnut dashboard were all made by young patients. The morgue is not the only exhibit down in the basement, but it is the creepiest, especially when you realize that the body coolers are still operational. Also, the museum curators have thoughtfully added to the ambiance by putting a dummy on the autopsy table and covering it with a sheet. I started my recording in the physical therapy room in the basement. May 26th, 2019. I'm in the basement of the Glore Psychiatric Museum, and I am actually standing in what used to be the hospital's physical therapy room. It was in use until 1997, so fairly recently. Got the K2 meter on. Is there anyone down here who would like to speak with me? I see a big tub here with a stretcher on which to lower someone into the water for hydrotherapy. Can you tell me what it was like to be in that water? The museum is open right now, so there are other museum patrons wandering around, including kids. So I'm going to do the best I can with recording. Maybe I'll catch a couple EVPs here and there. And we'll see what happens. Was the water warm that you soaked in? Oh, now this is interesting. I'm standing in front of a loom for weaving rugs, and the placard says, "Examples of rugs made by the patients for use in the hospital." Some were occasionally sold to the public if a surplus occurred. Rug weaving was an excellent form of occupational therapy. Patients worked out a lot of their feelings, particularly anger or aggression, in pulling the beater back on the loom with sufficient power to weave a good tight rug. During the 1950s, a ward of violent women from the Buchanan building were sent to the weaving shop each day as a release from some of their anger and aggression. The hospital weaving shop was in operation until about 1960. Can I talk to one of the women who worked at weaving these rugs? I'd love to talk with you. Your rugs are beautiful. Was it very hard to pick out a pattern? I can't identify that noise. What was your favorite color to use? There is somebody down here making those noises. Can you tell me about it? Can you say, "I'm here"? Okay. I am now standing in the morgue. I'm going to read from the placard here. The morgue and autopsy room were located originally in this building when it was constructed in 1969. Prior to that time, there was a morgue in the Park building where bodies were held and autopsies were completed when requested. Although the morgue is not being used at this time, the refrigeration units are still working, and the morgue trays are cold. The temperature of the coolers is maintained at about 40 degrees. Capacity 4 bodies. The morgue was used to hold the bodies of patients until family members made funeral home arrangements and had the bodies transported. The morgue and autopsy room were also put into use by the state of Missouri anytime there was a suspicious death or deaths that might involve foul play. At one point in the hospital's history, a family of 4 that were murdered in northwest Missouri were brought to this morgue and autopsies were performed. On occasion, bodies pulled from the river were brought to this morgue for identification, autopsies, and holding. Take my camera out here and take a couple of pictures. And if there's anyone here who wants to comment on what used to go on in these rooms, feel free to do so. I've always found it very interesting that we have ways to see how death occurred. They say that the dead do speak, and it's very useful to be able to look at a body and tell how someone passed away. That's the last thing you'll ever tell us. But it's very useful. Can someone come and talk to me, please? There's another placard here. It says, "Death at the State Hospital." The state of Missouri has death certificates online for the years 1910 to 1963. We can learn a lot about life at the state hospital by looking at these death certificates. 4,374 deaths had occurred at the state hospital by 1922. The majority of the patients died from natural causes, such as tuberculosis, stroke, syphilis, and pneumonia. In 1901, an epidemic of tuberculosis struck the hospital with a total of 207 deaths, and in 1921, syphilis killed 385 patients. There's a placard that says accidental deaths. The state hospital witnessed many accidental deaths. In 1938, a patient strangled in her restraints when she fell out of bed. In 1959, there were 13 deaths recorded as accidents. Strangely enough, that year there were 2 deaths from choking on peach seeds. Other patients died from head injuries after slipping on ice or falling out of bed. And the placard on intentional death reads, "Intentional deaths at the state hospital included suicides and murders. Patients killed themselves by hanging, setting themselves on fire, shooting themselves with guns, jumping off of buildings, and into wells. One patient poisoned himself with arsenic in 1934. That same year, a patient was murdered by another patient who used a spade handle to fracture the skull. So, boy howdy, there's a lot of ways to die, aren't there? Anybody here want to tell me how you died? Is there anyone here with me? If anyone is here, can you make a noise for me? Can you make the sheet on the body move? If you do, I'll shit myself. Gotta make it move on this side so I can actually see it. If it's moving on the other side, I'm not gonna know. Oh, come on, nobody wants to play with a paranormal investigator? I must be getting desensitized to this because 5-10 years ago, if I'd been faced with a body under a sheet like this in a morgue that used to actually be used as a morgue, even if I knew it was fake, I'd really be squicked out. If anyone wants to say something to me, now's your chance. Because I am not going to be staying here all that much longer. I gotta get on the road. No activity down here at all? Nobody wants to say anything? Nobody wants to come touch my meter? Okay, now we're wandering into the hallway where there's machinery going on, so it's gonna get noisy, so I'm gonna turn the recording off now. Alright, last chance. Anybody want to say anything? I'll go in here where it's a little quieter. Say something if you'd like to. The window of opportunity is closing. All right, well, if there's anyone down here, thank you for talking with me, if you did. A visit to the Glore Psychiatric Museum is a glimpse into the lives of people who came to the state hospital in search of help. Some of them found that help. Others did not. But the staff at the St. Joseph State Hospital did try to do their best by the people in their charge. Thanks for joining me on this road trip. Next time, we're going to take a look at the Dana House in Springfield, Illinois, which is still home to the woman who had it built. Let's explore the Springfield icon the next time we go lights out.